What do you do if your story sucks? Well, obviously, you're going to want to fix that, but what do you do when you're just not really sure where to go with it or you don't feel like it's got really any traction at all? Well, that is actually what I'm here to talk about. And this is my dog. Hey, buddy. Alrighty. Out. But yeah, so when I was writing Firebrand at the very, very beginning, I had that awesome idea. I was going with it, I was going for it, and it was working. And then suddenly it wasn't. And that was extremely frustrating. It was unbelievably frustrating because I thought that I had an idea that was going to be great. And then I ended up not. Well, believe it or not, what I did was something that I would recommend to you if you are writing a book and you might have an idea, but you're just not liking where it's going. And that's just simply to start over. This is actually acceptable to do. So, for those just joining us, hello, my name is Stefan, and I'm a fantasy author and a substitute teacher. So, I like to do a lot of things, and I especially love to write fantasy because fantasy is just absolutely fantastic. I am talking in this series about my book, Firebrand, Red Horizon, and going back to the history of this book, talking about how I came up with some of the ideas, how I came up with just all the different elements, what changes I decided to make along the lines, and just kind of a whole behind the scenes on my process when it came to getting the story together. Not just putting the words down, but actually how did I come up with the ideas and how did I get the storyline. So, believe it or not, I actually have in full handwritten copies, yes, all of the original documentation. As a side thing, I'm actually one of the few people that has gone through and done a full hard copyright of the entire draft of my book. So, yes, I literally have notebooks of basically handwritten pages of my first book. And then naturally, I went in, typed it in the computer so that I'd be able to process it better, so that I'd be able to actually submit it and all sorts of little details. But I like the handwriting process, it's actually pretty cool. So, before, like I did, I would start by reading the book and then kind of talk about things a little bit. I'm actually going to read you the stuff that I have, and I want you to pay attention because it's going to be kind of interesting. It starts off. The world is always changing, and since the world's creation, change has come and gone. As the years passed, so did the stories, passed through generations and cultures until the stories of the past became the myths and legends of the current day. Regian sighed as he closed the book. Then, pausing with his hand on the cover, he placed it back on the shelf. At nearly 6 feet in height, Eregian Farstrid was considered tall as far as the younger ones went, but was dwarfed by almost all the adult males. Even his father, Relegian Farstrid, who stood nearly a head taller than his son, was regarded as average. He had brown hair that had been lightened by the sun, or blonde hair that had been darkened, no one was quite sure anymore, but his eyes were bright blue, seeming almost to shine with their own light when the sun was at the right angle. A tug on his arm brought his attention to the boy who stood about to his elbow, with hair and eyes darker like their mother's. Regine smiled at the way his brother tried to keep impatience out of his eyes, but the furrowed brow and thin lips told the story more accurately. Bending down, he grabbed the boy around the legs, lifting him up to grab the book on the higher shelf. His mother insisted on an education for her children, never content with the excuse that he was already a skilled fisherman and woodsmith, and that he wanted to be a trader along the coast, like his father. She said the world was much larger than the village, and in order to survive in it, they must understand it. Lowering the boy, he caught the title, Legends of the Heroes, and smiled, remembering how his mother had taught him to read by that, entertaining him with stories of the great ship captains from the time of the Aquarian Wars. The The Icarians were few, but their vessels were some of the greatest ships the world had ever seen. Their nation, known now as the Five Mists, had sworn to stay out of the land of the Terran dwellers. Yet when invaders from the east sailed against Ildiz, the Icarians were there to meet them. Months they fought, and in the end, when Baven sent additional troops and ships, the Icarians left, never to be seen or heard from again. The story always went, however, that they would sail again one day. Still reading those old stories? He said with a laugh. Still believe they're foolish? His brother answered quickly, a gleam in his eye. I seem to recall you picking up this volume the other day, in fact. I never said it was foolishness, Eregian said, patting his brother, or putting his brother in a headlock. I just don't have time anymore. You used to make time, his brother said sadly. I used to play some of them out. Got a few of the other boys to sail around. Remember that boat we all built? Would still be here if not for that storm last year. Yeah, I remember those times, Eregian said with the same hint of sadness. That was when I was a boy. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. At the age of 20, a child became an adult at Westbrook. And once an adult, we're allowed to travel, work in a trade, or sail in the ships. His father worked part of the year as a merchant sailor and a fisherman as the rest. Now, however, since his son had just come of age, he was allowed light duty in order to mentor. Now that I'm a man, father's been taking me out on the boats working. I haven't really had the time. And you still don't have any time, my boy, his father said, coming down the stairs. Buttoning a black and gold jacket. Sorry, I'm literally trying to read my old handwriting. Not for a few weeks yet. We're running the Dragon's Teeth the next month. I'm taking you up the current. Now, hurry up, boy, and don't make the boys wait. Reggie bolted up the stairs. His father laughed. Turning his attention to his younger son, he smiled. Rallying, he said, in a few years, you'll be your brother's age. But for now, you'll be the man of the house. You know what that means, right? Yes, sir, I do, Rallying answered, still smiling. Good, his father said, going to the corner and picking up a package. Then it's time that I can give you this. Father, is this? Rallying began. Just open it, his father said with a laugh. I had a plan to give for your birthday, but now seem fine enough. 3 prongs gleamed silver, with the length about that of a short harpoon. The weight felt heavier than he was used to, but not uncomfortably so, and the handle a bit thicker. The weapon of the islanders, his father said proudly to the question he figured was coming. No weapon we wield unless it be used on the water or used as a tool. You always were a crack shot down on the cliff banks. I wouldn't be survived if you surpassed your brother one day. Why's the head heavier? He asked, running a finger along the edge of the prongs. Ow! Shoot, it's sharp. Something we learned years ago, his father said. Turning towards the stair, he yelled, Regian, hurry while we've time to cut. Turning back, he said to Rallian, long ago, when the war still plagued us, a man would carry 2 weapons, the sword and the spear. The spear would hit a man from a distance, could let the enemy get hit before you did, while the sword was short range, meant to hold back the enemy as a last resort. When the war was over, the weapons were put away and not seen until the next threat came. Our ancestors, having come to this island and realized metal was hard to come by, had to reforge our weapons into tools, harpoons, nails, hooks, in order for us to live. However, he finished with a chuckle, we're nothing if not resourceful. No reason a tool can't work as a weapon as well. Now, when I get back, I'll teach you how to handle it properly. Stripping out of his baggy breeches and loose shirt, he rummaged through his closet until he pulled out his travel clothes. Sighing, he brushed his hand over them, getting out the obvious wrinkles, then started pulling the uncomfortable items on. Pants were the worst, he thought, loose enough to let him move around, but much too tight where rigging was concerned. Nearly every boy learned to move on the boats as soon as he could swim, which was sometimes sooner than he could walk. And the first thing a boy learned was how to operate the rigging. For that reason, most fathers didn't care if their sons spent most of their day in a crow's nest, saying any boy who could love the sea had their family blood run strong. Of course, granted, Reggie chuckled at that. Most boys would use it as an excuse to get out of chores or the occasional punishment. Bending his knees, feeling the fabric tighten around his leg, reminded him he wasn't going to be going up there anytime soon. The boots were next, black leather that felt off. When he first received them, he had been amazed that water couldn't get in no matter how much water was around. But the novelty died off after being at sea a few days and forgetting what the ship felt like to his feet. At least they were comfortable, he thought. The shirt was next, and while not uncomfortable to wear, it made him uncomfortable wearing it. Holding the shirt limp in his hand and standing straight, even that brought out his defined muscles created by sun-darkened skin. He wasn't embarrassed by his body. At 170 pounds, he was all lean muscle, able to work a full shift during the herring runs and have strength to laugh and joke with the men in the end. Rather, he was embarrassed by the attention girls tended to give him because of it. Girls and their mothers who seemed they wanted to marry him on the spot with their daughter if he even shared the slightest interest. Oh yes, adulthood had its drawbacks. Keeping the shirt loose, he tucked his jacket under his arm and grabbed his spear from against the wall, heading for the stairs. He stopped off at the landing, looking at the picture hanging on the wall. She was beautiful, dark brown hair that fell just beyond her shoulders, and skin as white as could get without being pale. Her eyes were warm, even though a picture, and her smile was like a ray of light parting a storm. He smiled back, lightly kissing his fingers and touching them to her face. Well, Mom, he said to the picture, my first trade run. I wish you were here to see me off, like you did with Dad all those times before. But I know you're in a better place. I'll see you again, one day. But for now, the wind's in my sails, and the sea calls me out, so I have to answer. Something seemed to lift in his stomach when he walked down the stairs, or in his mind. Whatever it was, his feet moved lighter than they had a few moments earlier. You'll want to put that jacket on, my boy, his father said as he reached the landing. Wind's picked up, and it'll only blow harder out at sea. Sorry, sir, he said. Just feel strange is all. I'm still getting used to it. Besides, I'm not a captain. I'm a cartographer. You're my son, his father said with a laugh, and I'm the captain, so you'll look the part of my navigator, which means you won't look like a simple fisherman. But I am a fisherman, he said with a smile, and then laughed. And so are you, for that matter. Besides, what difference does it make what I look like? People have never cared before. I live, I work. If I do bad, I get disciplined. If I do good, I'm rewarded. That's all that's ever mattered. If only the world worked that way, his father said, smiling. Unfortunately, in order to deal with others, to be accepted by others, we must be like others, and others expect us to look the part. Besides, this is another lesson for your education. You're going to learn to deal with people who are always right, even when they're wrong. Unfortunately, you've lived among people who know how to see reason, such as what a man can do and what a man can't do. And that was it. So I got to the end of that part, and I was just stuck. Like, I had no idea what I wanted to do with it. I had no idea where I really wanted this thing to go. Really, I had the characters established. I had relationships established. I had open dialogue, but I just was not feeling it. Now, bear in mind, this was literally my first draft. So all of those little stumbling bits, that was all the little errors that I had made periodically. It was in its completely raw form. And so I was going, and then I kind of realized I didn't really know where I was. Like, I didn't know what was going on officially. I didn't know what was going on as far as the like physical locations. I didn't have any idea of what was going on with just geography. I didn't know my world. So I put it down and I just stopped it. And this was one of the best decisions that I could have made because then after getting over the initial, I've got the awesome idea and I'm just going to go with it. Then I started to do a little bit more thinking, a little bit more planning, and eventually things started to change. Brought to you unofficially by coffee, the nectar of the gods. So, already there's a few things in there that have made some major changes. My main character, his name is Josian. In the original story, his name was Oregian. Well, when I first created this book and I first thought, oh my gosh, Oregian is such a cool name, then I had to question and go, why do I think this is so cool? Is this something that I've already heard before and already exists? And sure enough, it was already used by Tolkien, which, let's be honest, he's one of the best authors out there as far as fantasy goes. He's not everyone's taste, I understand that, but he is absolutely fantastic when it comes to creating worlds, creating languages, creating people, creating just fantasy stories in general. And he had already used that. And so I thought, man, I don't really want to do that because now suddenly people are going to look at it and they're always going to compare it to Tolkien. And you hear oftentimes, do you want to be the next Tolkien? Do you want to be the next J.K. Rowling? Do you want to be the next Brandon Sanderson, et cetera, et cetera? No, I want to be the first me. I want people to recognize me, so I want it to be mine. Well, you're also going to notice that I've got the dynamic between him and his younger brother. His younger brother was considerably younger in this first draft. One of the first gifts that you see given is basically a trident, and this was a symbol to basically symbolize a boy becoming a man, and it really had no kind of pomp and circumstance surrounding it. You notice that his mom is dead in this one, and yeah, those are a few things that were changed in the next draft. I really wanted the brothers' dynamic to be much different. The brother is considerably older in the next version. The mom is alive. He's actually got a sister, so he's got a much bigger dynamic family. The father still has maintained that character for the most part, so not a whole lot has changed with them. But one of the biggest changes is just where everything starts. So in this first one, he's at home and he's just kind of living, doing his thing. He starts off with the reading of the book, but I really didn't want that to be my story. I wanted things to start off a little bit more exciting. And so when I did scrap it, I actually rewrote it to have him starting on his father's boat. And he's actually part of one of the sailing missions. So you see him actually engaging with other people. And not to mention, you also saw some of the first main, I guess, story hooks. And that was another thing that I realized with this one. I didn't really have any hook. There was nothing that was really driving these characters to do anything. There was nothing to really push these characters into some outstanding situation. There was nothing making these characters want to do anything. And that was one of the biggest things that I noticed. I didn't have that sense of agency. But before I went and I did the redo there, I thought what I really need to do for myself is I really need to make a map and I really need to figure out where things are. So here is that first map. And you'll notice that it's kind of crude because, yeah, it's meant to be crude. Well, you will also notice this particular map. That is the continent of literacy, which is this map here. And one of the first things that you'll notice is the whole thing is upside down. Well, believe it or not, this was actually something that developed as I was in college. I was sitting at one of the tables, I was working on my maps, and one of my friends came over. He looked at it, and when he looked at it, one of the maps didn't have a lot of the labeling, and so he looked at it upside down and he thought, hey, this is really cool, and kind of talked about some of the tropes that were common when it came to other fantasy maps, such as having the kind of extra land always being on the right side, and by flipping it, now suddenly had the land extra on the left side. What I had to do when I went and did the rewrite naturally meant I had to change all of my north and south around, east and west around, and that was a little bit kind of confusing, but it worked. It worked in the end. And one of the things too, when it came to this particular map, that's actually really hilarious. My scaling was completely off, and I actually had to go through multiple drafts of just the map to get the scales correct. So, with that first map, all that it really was just a placeholder. It was that initial, how do I vision my world? What do I want to do with the world? And from there, I've made many additional maps. I made a lot of big changes. I redeveloped my map making techniques to be something I think is kind of cool. But yeah, the maps themselves, they underwent a lot of changes. So then once I got the map and once I got the world figured out, then I started to dive into the actual story. So, like I said at the very beginning, what do you do when you don't like where the story is going? And you are allowed to start it over. Sometimes you're going to have a great idea and you're not going to deliver it the way that you want to deliver it. And so when it comes out, it's going to feel like possibly crap. That just happens. And a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of, because the story feels like crap, then I need to scrap the story idea. But the reality is, the story might be perfect. It just needs to be told in a different way. So if you're working on your own story and you're finding that it's just not quite right, it's just not quite working, think about a couple things. First off, do your characters have a reason to advance? Yeah. If your character does not have a reason to do anything more in the story, then they don't have that sense of urgency that is actually necessary to drive a story forward. Some people seem to think that they can let things happen, and yeah, situations can happen to a character, but they still have to react to it. They still have to respond to it. They still have to do something with it. With my main character, there's a lot of circumstances that happen to him, but he has to respond to them. If he didn't respond to them and if he did nothing with it, there would be no story. So when you're presented with problems of characters not wanting to advance, think about what will make them actually advance. Number two, if you are struggling with figuring out that detail, take some time to actually develop your characters outside of the story. Spend time thinking about your characters. Spend time thinking about your like the character motivations, the character backstory. The backstory affects where they go from there. If you are interested in this kind of stuff, I actually have a really cool 4-book series called So You Want to Write a Fantasy Book. And it started off just as kind of just on a whim, but then I got a lot of support with it and ended up making a few sequels to it. So the first book talks about the story as a whole. It'll help you develop your main character. It'll help you develop the immediate setting. It'll help you develop an appropriate antagonist. And then it'll also give you some kind of things to think about, situations for your character to respond to, as well as a few plot ideas to get the story going. But what's really cool is at the very back of it, I also include my map making tutorial. Well, for the sequel, the second book, that one dives into just character. So, all sorts of ways to develop characters by themselves. Third book develops setting as a whole. Fourth book dives into creating an appropriate antagonist. So, if you're interested, I'll include those links in the comments below. But yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, and so much of how we write, it just comes to, if we understand the characters, then we're solid. The coolest thing too about when you understand your characters, when you understand their motivations, they end up telling you the story that they're going to do. You'll come into a situation and they'll tell you how they want to respond to it. They'll tell you what they care about. And so you find that it's actually so much easier to write the story once you understand what your characters want to do with it. So, just a little tip there. But diving in, so you saw how the first part was. You saw what originally happened. Well, this is the original chapter 1, which is now conveniently chapter 2. Like I said, with the original, or with the chapter 1 for this book, that was originally the prologue, whereas this chapter 2, this is the first chapter of the book. So we just ended with Mayor. He had his whole company basically killed. He discovered that the nightmares of his basically stories are suddenly real, and that now he has to deal with it. So now, getting into chapter 2, thousands of miles away to the east, beyond the shadows and cliffs of the Truvana Mountains, across the grassy plains of Ubavan and the Great Western Road, and near a spit of land at the edge of the Geborgen Sea, a lone vessel made its way home. Unaware of the distant troubles, it minded its own on the gentle waves of the fjord, bobbing casually as its captain and most of the crew remained asleep under its sturdy decks. At 10 paces across and 8 times that long, she was considered moderately sized. 3 towering masts held aloft torn and yellowed canvas sails that showed almost as much patchwork as there was original sail, and chipped letters painted across the soft gray bow spelled out Dawn's Embrace. It was a little past sunrise, enough so that the sky was still dark off to the west. A sliver of orange flame rose above the horizon, reflecting off the water, but only a few eyes on this ship were awake to witness its glory. The first was the night watchman from the last shift, a short but burly man who went by Iron. He had fair but tan-skinned hair as black as coal that he kept neatly trimmed, and dark gray eyes that could pierce a moonless sky. The second was a younger man who had joined him partway through, and he went by Josiah. Like Iran, he had fair tan skin, but he was taller and more toned, strong but considerably smaller. His eyes were bright and blue, like an evening sky during a storm. The way his dirty blonde hair sat could make one think he had challenged said storm. Both had slept well, despite the gale from the night before. But for a third, stumbling up on the deck, the morning appeared anything but glorious. "Good morning, David," Josiah called to the half-asleep crewman with a mirthful tone. There was a lightness to him, an air of freedom and peace, but also purpose, intent, and a willingness to leap into action at a moment's notice that gave the newcomer a pause. "You had a full night's sleep. You look like you were awake for most of it." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," David replied, rubbing sleep out of his eyes and fighting back a yawn. Younger than Josiah by 5 years, and Iran by 10. David was the youngest crewman on Dawn's Embrace, but he pulled his own. Muscular but lanky, he kept his dark hair cut short and his face clean, save for a small patch on his chin, and his brown eyes had a silver glint many girls considered attractive. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak again, Josiah cut him off. David, for the last time, I'm still Josiah, he said, laughing. I'm the captain's son, but I'm not the captain, so no special bowing or anything for me. Give him some slack, Iran said from his position on the mast. If he wants to bow to the future Lord of the Seas, Commander of Storms, Slayer of Death, don't you start, Iran. Josiah laughed. I rue the day I ever showed a personality in front of you. Meh, I like my ocean masters springy, Iran joked, dropping down. Come to think of it, your pa's been pushing the captain bit pretty hard for a while now, hasn't he? More than I would prefer, Josiah answered somberly, shaking his head. But not just him either. I've heard comments like that through the village from time to time. There's Josiah, he'll be a captain one day. Hey, Josiah, when are you going to follow your father's footsteps? Hey, Josiah, you'll be perfect for my daughter. Did you know the Storm once threatened to sign on as soon as I gained my captainship? The Rockthorns, too, said when I got a ship they'd keep her together, so I guess that means they'd back me. And don't even let my brother start talking. Callion will get anyone to follow him. You don't want to be a captain? David asked. When we talked, I always thought, one day I do, Josiah said nonchalantly, though he turned to look out over the waves. His hand closed around one of the mast lines, and he stretched himself taller, the light of the rising sun illuminating his face. One day, I'll push to be captain, he added softly. But right now, I just like being one of the crew. I like a simple hard day's work, the feel of the wind or the salty spray on tired muscles, and having a drink as I talk about the day's catch. I like climbing the ropes and keeping a sail together during a storm, knowing I had a direct hand in making it happen and keeping her together. More than anything, I like sailing with my old man. Even with his conditions? Iran asked with a knowing grin. Yes, even with them, Josiah continued, taking the comment in stride. Then paused, turning slowly with his mouth twisting in a half frown. Wait, how did you know about them? Everyone knows about them, Iran scoffed. Think about it. A person like you disappears for about half the day, only showing up in the morning when it's absolutely necessary. Honestly, I wondered about that myself at first, David confessed. We all did, Iran continued. Well, naturally, we asked questions, and some speculated further. Our current theory is that one day he's going to make you first mate until you're ready to push for your own ship, which right now seems pretty likely. After all, he did make you navigator this trip, which, might I add, it's been a good one so far. Well, thank you for that, Josiah said. I mean that, honestly. At least I won't be able to say I'm not prepared. Wait a minute. David, why are you up right now? I lost the game last night, he said with a shrug. I have to pull anchor. Josiah and Iran shared knowing looks. Happens to the best of us, Josiah said lightly, slapping David's arm. Give me a bit and I'll give you a hand. As for you, Iran, you should have time to get a decent breakfast. What happens in a bit? David asked. On cue, the sound of heavy bootsteps carried up on deck. David and Iran excused themselves as the owner of those steps appeared. Although Josiah was taller than most, the captain of Dawn's Embrace dwarfed him in more than just height. With rich, dark brown hair and a thick, curly beard that covered his face, his eyes had a steely gaze that could break stone or stop a bear in its tracks. The sea looks good today, the captain announced, his voice deep and strong as he stared out across the water. He took a deep breath, letting it out casually as his eyes closed. These are the moments, Josiah thought, with the wind blowing casually and the salty air filling his nose and tongue. These are the moments I live for. The peace, the life, the joy. It does indeed. Good morning, Father. Yes, it is a good morning, his father, Captain Ralshan, answered. Though on this ship, it seems you've forgotten that it's captain. I haven't forgotten, sir, Josiah answered calmly, though respectfully. But as I recall, it's only captain around the crew, and, as you can see, there aren't any of the crew around. A fair point that I'll concede, his father said, laughing. As I like to say, rules, they're like the sea. Some days they're harsh, other days they're mild. Sometimes they're rigid, and other times they're flexible, but whatever their condition, you can either fight them and struggle, or go with them to make your life better, Josiah finished to his father's knowing nod. I know them all. Good that you finally have been listening, his father said, scratching the mane of a beard that nearly covered his warm and wild grin. So, navigator, where are we now? Eastern end of Zafri Sound, Jashine answered. I looked over the maps last night, and I put us about 2 days from home, assuming all goes well, and assuming we don't have another storm delay. 2 days sounds right, Alshane agreed, and your numbers sound accurate. Shame we can't cut that down to less. I know, Jashine said. It'd be nice to get back for Callian, but we ran according to schedule. Everything has worked as planned. Everyone is still well, and the one way to make it faster isn't worth the risk to the crew. Yes, I agree, Ralston said, mirroring his son's affirmation. Well, we best get started then. What are you up so early for? Wait, you didn't lose last night, did you? No, sir, I didn't lose, Joshane answered. I wasn't in the competition last night anyway, since I had first watch. I'm up to help whoever did pull anchor, though. Figured I'd get in a bit of exercise before having to sit below deck. Besides, you know Norvik. He hauls the last man up to pull kitchen duty. If I do any job on this ship, it's not going to be his punishment. Spoken as a true bastard, his father said proudly, slapping him on the shoulder. And spoken as a good crewman. You got the makings of a good captain in there. Well, I am your son, Jeshine answered, putting a hand on his father's. I learned from the best, but I have a few years to go yet. Ah, that's where you're wrong, Ralston sighed, turning his head as the first crew members were making their way on deck. Knowledge, experience, loyalty, commitment. Those are what makes a captain, not the years. For some, it does take many years, true, but for others, it will only take a few. You have the makings of greatness in you. When you choose to acknowledge them, though, only you can answer. You already know the first rule. Do what needs to be done. The second rule, though if only by a bare margin, is trust the men, and they'll trust you in return. Mainlanders all seem to think that rank determines the wealth and worth of a man, but what good is rank if the people aren't willing to follow? Rank may get you finery and things, and titles will get you prestige in others' eyes, but trust will give you respect, and true respect will give you true followers. Brothers. You do what needs to be done, you always have, and that's one thing I'll always be proud of you for. Keep to those principles, and you'll do fine. Now, go on, get about your work. The rest of the crew came up from below deck, rubbing sleep from tired eyes or holding cups of hot coffee. Jashine tapped his hand to his forehead in a salute and stepped away as Will, his father's first officer, walked up. After dodging around barrels and nearly tripping over a coil of rope that had been left at the base of the center mast, he came up to David, who was preparing to raise the anchor. Took you long enough, mate, David said, once Jashine had moved near to him. Jashine tossed his shirt to the deck and took a position on the anchor line. That's better, Jashine laughed, getting a solid grip on the rope. The two pulled in tandem, seasoned fishing muscles strained against the massive weight, until they brought the awkward mass up to the edge. Jashine held the rope steady, bracing his foot against the ship's rail. And once he felt certain of his grip, David leaned over and brought it the rest of the way up. After tying the anchor where it would be out of the way, the two slumped against the deck and basked in the sunlight that was winning over the darkness, smiling at the bit of blue that had saturated the sky. On either side of the fjord, they were anchored. On either side of the fjord, there were anchored mountains rose, decorated either by dark green forest or steep gray street cliffs. Thanks, mate, David said cheerfully. I could have done it myself, but since you insisted on helping, I couldn't say no. Sure, Jashine answered, closing his eyes for a moment as he leaned back and let the sun warm his skin. I'll let you solo it next time then. Or, better yet, let's just drop it over the side right now and you can show me yourself. Pass, thank you, David answered, grabbing Jashine's shirt and throwing it at his head. Jashine caught it easily and tucked it behind him. After a bit, David added, How soon do you think we'll be getting home? About 2 days, Jashine answered, sitting up and using his shirt to wipe his brow. He stood up and turned to offer his hand to David, who, after taking it, pulled himself to his feet. That was one of the things I had to speak with the captain about. Well, we're on schedule at least, David said, his voice carrying a tone of disappointment. He knuckled his back and stretched. I mean, don't get me wrong, seeing other ports was amazing and all. Really gave an idea of how much bigger our community is. And I really had fun at Spearbreaker and Stalwart, but there's something to be said about being home with family and Sierra. Plus, everywhere has their own rules and customs we must follow over there due to those oaths. Never really thought about what they meant until now. So, Sierra does hold your heart then, Shashine said, grinning. Rumors get passed around all the time, and it's amazing how words get twisted. True, but this rumor is correct. I've only been seriously interested in her for a few months, but I think she'll be my bride one day, assuming her dad's fine with it and all. If I know him at all, Shashine assured him, he will be more than happy knowing you're interested in her. That being said, I fear for anyone who voices interest in my sis having to go through my father. I kind of want to see that, David said. I kind of want to too, Shashine agreed, laughing. But speaking of fathers, looks like it's time to heed the words of mine and get to my own work. Take care of yourself, mate. Shashine left David and went below to the cabin he shared with his father. Closing the door, he shut away the sounds of the deck and prepared for another few hours of study. He started by stacking a small pile of old maps and logbooks on a side table, and then went to the boarded-up cupboard to pull down some worn volumes. The sound still drifted through, though, and then he felt a lurch as the ship began to start off. Settling the longing in his feet that had started to build, he grudgingly sat down at the captain's desk to study. Sailing filled him with joy and purpose, especially sailing with his father, and the open sea always felt free. There were times, though, that he regretted the agreement he made with the older sea captain. His father had long been regarded as one of the best sea traders on Firebrand Island, possibly among the 9 islands, and his crews were never left wanting for hands. When any voyage came about, he had his choice of crew. Though anyone strong enough, once reaching the age of 10, earned the right to sail with the fishing ships, only those who had come of age were allowed on the deep-sea ships and trading vessels, with no exceptions. Prior to coming of age, Shashine dreamed of the day he would sail by his father's side, possibly as first mate, but when the day of his first trip arrived, he learned that not only being his son didn't carry the weight he had hoped, but he also didn't have the skills to truly deserve to be on his father's crew. His father had other thoughts, though, for when Shashine told him of his concerns, he presented his own terms. Put simply, Shashine would be allowed to sail every route his father sailed, provided that from the time the crew awoke to the midday meal, Shashine would devote himself to studying. Ordinary people don't sail on my ships, he heard his father's words echo in his mind, and they never have. If you want to be ordinary, then you could take the ordinary routes. But if you want the best, if you want to sail the whole of the 9 islands and beyond, then being average won't cut it. You must be much more. He knew exactly what his father had in mind. He knew his father's intentions. However, he wanted to sail more, so he swore to himself to endure. Some of the lessons he did enjoy, though, such as studying the maps. Maps were always fascinating, and when he was younger, he used to dream of what the other islands or distant lands even looked like. He had already seen most of the islands he'd wanted to see, but every new place only made him want to see more, see further. He learned to write and read through daily log entries, which a condition placed upon him even earlier on when he was just a cabin boy. Day's wage for a day's entry, his father had said. That's how you'll be paid, and I will require full sentences. After discovering words, however, he discovered history, and then his dreams were given substance and wings. Far-off lands and battles could now be painted in his mind, but also he could finally understand what all his father and the other captains really did. He discovered the joys of astronomy when stories told of how past ships used to use the sky to navigate, and mathematics helped turn general distances and speed into actual calculable numbers. Everything had value, he concluded. He just wasn't sure if he was ready for what it all meant. Sometime in the middle of his reading of History of the Adenari War, he put the book down and leaned back, closing his eyes. In this glorious war, the last of the great Adenari fleet had come to the aid of the mainland before being lost to the histories. This was the war that drove back the Dark One, whose name no one even knew now, away from the free people of Lyracy. It had also helped unite the people together and ushered in 1,000 years of peace. Nations allied together where once they had been at war. Heroes grew up from ordinary people and were turned into legends. The battles played around in his mind, filling him with longing to have been part of their world. He saw the ships of the last fleet arrive on the mainland, their white sails trimmed in golden thread that caught fire in the sunset. He saw the moonlight reflect off the blades of the Grey Wardens as they danced through mobs of the enemy, clearly outnumbered but never faltering in their strides. He heard the thunder of hooves as Baven Lancers joined other Senation cavalry on the open plains, mowing down the forces of Malin. In his heart, he felt pain at what the people must have suffered and endured, yet excitement that people were capable of such feats. He knew many called the word story, and it was a story of origins and endings, but he also believed it to be true. Or rather, he wanted to believe it was true, because if it was true, then people could do what was ascribed, and people could be fantastic. He heard commotion on the deck before footsteps sounded in the hall, and then David came bursting into the cabin. Captain's calling you up, mate. Says there's trouble. What kind of trouble? Jashine asked, putting down the book and following David. Captain didn't say much, David answered. Just that there's a shipwreck off our starboard bow. Well, not much of a ship now, but I'm not sure how many there are. The captain says you should be up there. Jashine emerged onto the deck with David, which was full of energy as crewmen rushed around the deck and others worked to lower a small dinghy into the water. A second boat had already left, their crew rowing towards the ship, which Jashine agreed didn't look like much of a ship at all anymore. Captain, he asked, walking up to his father, what do you need? Take a look, the captain answered, handing him a spyglass. See that little patch of white off by the rocks? I see it, sir, he answered. Poor thing looks torn to pieces. I'm counting 6 bodies, and 1 man waving. Ship's so bad, though, I don't even know where they're from. They're in bad shape, his father agreed. Take David and prepare some beds down below. You two will be on medical care duties for the rest of the trip. Aye, Captain, Jashine answered, subdued. David, let's get started. Aye, sir, he said, but stopped short. Sorry, forgot. By the time they had finished their preparations, making do the best they could despite not having much in the way of medicine or space, the rescue boats had returned. 1 man, a worn-out, frail individual with long white hair and beard, whom Jashine recognized as the one waving, wept openly. He watched as bodies were pulled carefully from the boat and laid out on the deck, where other crewmen would check for signs of life. Jashine bent down to one body, a middle-aged man from his looks who was dressed in raggedy blue clothing, and felt for a pulse. The body felt cold and stiff, though, and he sighed, looking at the old man with sympathy, as all around him the crewmen were having similar luck, and the body count far exceeded the original amount he had seen through the glass. But then, 1 man, Jane, got excited. Captain, he said, this one, I don't know how, but this kid's still got life in him. He's alive? The old man asked, ceasing his weeping, and Jashine felt a hopeful smile across his face. The boy is alive? He's weak, real weak, Jane answered. But he's fighting. Doesn't have long, though, maybe a few days at best. It'll take a couple days to get home, Will, the first officer added. And even that's pushing it by the looks of him, the captain said, bending down to lay a hand gently across his forehead. How much time do you think he has? The old man asked. The captain sighed, then wiped his hand on his pant leg. Maybe a day. Then we'll have to make time. All heads turned towards Jashine, and movement stopped as eyes fell upon him. The air seemed to grow thicker and colder as everyone, including the old man and the captain, looked his way. Will cleared his throat. How can we make time? Will asked. You know the routes, you said yourself 2 days. Aye, I know the routes, Jashine answered, thinking to himself the odds of the boy's survival. I know all the routes we can take. I know all the routes we can take. If I may be so bold, I know the one that will get us home in time, with a bit to spare. It's not easy, and I wouldn't suggest it if there was another route, but the Sword Strait lies not even a mile from here. Time-wise, we'll gain a day and a half. You are right. It's not easy, the captain agreed. But you are also right that we would make it in time. You up for it again, Captain? Will asked. Not me, the captain said, shaking his head. Only ever go once. But does anyone know another way? Josiah asked, after feeling a heavy silence fall. He looked around, catching glances and head scratching, but no one had suggestions. Others looked at him with a strange curiosity, but Josiah brushed it off. Because I see no other way, and if that's what it takes, then I'll take it. If there were any eyes not looking at him before, all eyes fell upon him now. He resisted the urge to massage his neck and forced himself not to look around, for fear of falling under the weight of people's expectations. Joshin, Will began, in a tone that, though quiet, resonated in Joshin's stomach. Are you sure you know what you're asking? 2 men are still alive and need help, one of them barely clinging to life. With time now as his enemy, we can't afford to waste any. I see only 2 options here, and one involves a man losing his life for certain. I refuse to accept that. Captain, are you willing to risk this ship? The captain asked, almost in warning, but also almost challenging. Are you willing to risk this ship, my ship, to save these men? Are you willing to risk this crew, all for one man? I know this ship, Joshin answered, looking his father in his eye. And I know this crew. I also know that if a chance to save a man's life exists, then it should be taken over accepting the certainty of his death. It needs to be done. Then do it, the captain ordered. None of the crew moved now. Captain Joshin began, but his father cut him off. It needs to be done, the captain agreed. I agree. And you made the claim. So do it. Take the helm, son. Will you be the captain now? Joshin looked around again, this time looking intently at the rest of the crew. Some were openly grinning. He looked back at the bodies lying on the deck, seeing Jane hunch over the body of the boy. He looked into the old man's eyes and saw the pleading. Finally, he looked back at his father. Aye, sir, Joshin answered, feeling a warmth rise from his core and travel through the rest of his body. He stood up tall, straight, feeling a new strength he hadn't known before, and clenched his fists. He looked his father evenly in the eyes, and the captain looked back. Many emotions crossed the captain's face at that moment, with joy and excitement at the forefront. But beyond all of them, pride. The weight of that pride settled, and Joshin swallowed. Joshin Farstad, the captain said. The ship is yours. So, that is my second chapter, technically first chapter of this book. And as you can see, there were a lot of changes that were made to that one as opposed to the one that I read originally. I've got Joshin on the ship as opposed to at home. We don't see Callian yet, but we do reference him. As a side note, Callian was, he was Rallian. So I changed that name a little bit. And so there were a lot of changes that were made just to make this first chapter happen. And then later on, so this was one of the first chapters that I submitted to my creative writing class. And I've got a little bit more that is technically part of that chapter. But as I was going through and I realized that I had a lot of stuff, I ended up breaking up the chapter into more. And that was one thing that I really realized. I would not go into a lot of detail because I wouldn't think that a lot of detail was really necessary. And then some of the biggest comments that people from my creative writing groups would say was, I want to see more of this. I want this developed more. I wanted to actually see what you were talking about here as opposed to just it happened, move on. So I made a lot of those kind of changes, just giving a little bit more. And if you're finding that maybe you have a really short story and you just want it to be quite a bit longer, take some time to go into some of the descriptions. Take some time to develop time just a little bit more. Don't just necessarily say they went from this place to this place. Talk about the journey in between, because sometimes the journey is what people like to read. Sometimes the destination is what people like to read. Pay attention to what people are saying and what people are enjoying. That's going to give you a really good idea of where you actually need to go. So, yeah, like I said, that was chapter 2. And in the description, I've got the links for that book and also for the second book, Crimson Shore. So, definitely check those out. And I just wanted to thank you for hanging out today, talking about this. It's a lot of fun. I really love my book. I really do. And it's awesome just to see where it all came from. So it was cool to go back into that and reread that for you guys. So if you enjoy this kind of stuff, please give this channel a like, or this video a like, and the channel subscribe. It really helps a lot, helps me grow, and helps me be able to make more videos. Yeah, and depending on how popular these kind of things can go, one of the plans that I've got for this channel is eventually getting some merch out. So for that, one of the biggest problems is that I kind of need to have a, paid or a paid channel. So if you enjoy this kind of stuff, please definitely share it with your friends. Take a look at my longer videos as well. The more watch time I get, the more YouTube says that I'm actually decent. So check that out. And also just, leave some comments and just all that stuff. Just, I would really love to see some of the interactions. So hopefully you guys will join me on my next live video. I'll be going into the next chapter on this one. And yeah, I suck at endings. So take care. Have an excellent rest of the day. And yeah.